Hello, everyone. Professor Kurzlik here. So, over the weekend, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent came out and during his interview says sometimes you have to escalate to de-escalate. These statements got a bit of media coverage. The front page of NBC talked about it. The Bulwark um, podcast talked about it, and it got me thinking about how many people really understand or have thought about what Besant was saying. So when we hear we need to escalate to de-escalate, we can think of like what does that actually mean? Because on the surface, it can kind of sound contradictory, almost backwards. If you want to end a conflict, why would a government official, a Trump administration official, saying we need to increase the conflict to decrease the conflict? So, why would increasing conflict ever reduce it? In political science, and especially in international relations, this idea does have a very specific meaning, though. It reflects a rather long standing political science theory about how conflicts can eventually come to an end. Not simply through restraint or saying we're just going to end hostilities, but through calculated pressure to increase the conflict. So we'll see that there are some drawbacks and some critics of this theory, but at its core, escalate to de escalate means that a state can deliberately increase the intensity of a conflict in order to force its opponents to back down in that conflict. The goal, thus, is not to reach total war, like my video with escalation, the escalation ladder looked at. So it's not looking to move up the escalation ladder in an uncontrolled manner. The goal is to instead change the opponents, change the adversary's decision making. If the costs of continuing the conflict suddenly rise, the opponent may decide that continuing simply isn't worth remaining in that conflict. So, thus, you're escalating to de escalate. So, when we hear this U.S. official use this phrase, um, they're usually not calling for unlimited escalation. Again, they don't want to walk all the way up that escalation ladder. But what Scott Bessent was undoubtedly saying is that they are referring to the current level of pressure simply isn't working to find a resolution to the conflict. The adversary may believe that they can endure the present level of intensity when it comes to conflict. And because of that, the conflict will continue. The solution, if you subscribe to this IR thought, is that to raise the stakes quickly and visibly, the other side is forced to then reconsider their position that, okay, maybe we need an end to this conflict. So this can take, and this does take, many forms. It might mean stronger U.S. economic sanctions. It could mean expanding military aid to an ally. It might involve military signaling with maybe more troop deployments, more military exercises, or even limited strikes. Not saying these all fit the U.S.-Iran conflict, but within the political science IR literature, we see that these measures can all be escalatory. So the specific tolls can, of course, vary depending on the conflict, but the logic itself remains the same. Increase pressure now to shorten the conflict later. So this idea is closely tied to the idea of coercion in international relations. I'll put a link to a pretty famous piece It lays out this in greater detail than this video does, but scholars like Thomas Schilling argued that the key to influencing an adversary is not necessarily defeating them outright, but shaping their expectations about the future. If they believe things are going to get significantly worse, they may choose to concede before that escalation actually happens, before things get out of control and get worse. So the strategy of escalating to de-escalate rests on a critical assumption that escalation can be controlled. Remember, we did a video about the escalation ladder. Sometimes what makes sense, an attack, a sanction, an attack, might make sense in that moment, but it can walk up that escalation ladder. So this idea of coercion, this idea of escalate to de-escalate, has the underlying idea that increasing pressure just enough to change the opponent's behavior is what you want without triggering a large and uncontrollable conflict, or again, walking up that escalation ladder. So supporters of this approach, like the Trump administration, would argue that it can better prevent long wars, better prevent long drawn-out wars. If one side demonstrates overwhelming resolve early on, which the Trump administration is saying they can do, it may avoid prolonged fighting. So in that sense, what the Trump administration is saying is that escalation can be seen as a tool for actually shortening the conflict. However, of course, because it's a political science theory, because scholars are always trying to make sense of the world, there are critics of this. They see it very differently. Many of these critics argue that escalation is inherently risky. Once you raise the stakes, you don't fully control how the other side will respond. They may not back down. They may actually escalate further themselves. And what begins as a calculated move quickly spirals into a much larger confrontation. This is the central tension. The same strategy that aims to end a conflict can also inadvertently expand the conflict. So when you hear a policymaker, or you're watching the news, or you're following along on social media, and you hear a policymaker say, we need to escalate to de-escalate, what they are really saying is that the current level of pressure is insufficient to change the behavior of the adversary. And the only way to change the outcome is to increase the costs for the opponent, so they thus change their behavior. So whether that works or not really depends on perception. Does the opponent believe you're willing to keep escalating? Do you believe the risks are real? And most importantly, do they see backing down as less costly than continuing? Because if they don't, then escalation doesn't lead to de-escalation. And again, we have to keep in mind that conflicts are oftentimes unpredictable. You don't know how the other side will respond. You have an idea, you might have an understanding of the leadership, of the leader, of the confrontation, of how long they can keep the confrontation going, but you never have a complete full image of how the other side will respond. So it's just something I heard on NBC. I think it was on NBC over the weekend, and I thought it was worthwhile making a video and kind of chatting with you all about what he meant when he said escalate to de-escalate. Okay, thank you very much.